In the opening shots, we see 88-year-old Zev Guttman calling for his wife Ruth in his sleep. He wakes up disoriented and comes out of his room asking where his wife is. A nurse named Paula reminds him that Ruth passed away 2 weeks ago.
I was Mrs. Guttman's nursing aide.
Paula took the man to breakfast. Like many elderly people, he lives out his days in the nursing home in New York State. During breakfast, Zev sits at the table with his friend Max Rosenbaum, who reminds him of his promise. Unfortunately, because of dementia, Zev can't remember anything. Today is the last day of mourning for Ruth. Zev told his granddaughter that he met Ruth in America after he moved from Germany. Max surreptitiously handed the envelope to his friend and told him to read the letter when he was alone. Telling the son that he was tired, Zev went to his room and opened the envelope. Following the instructions in the letter, Zev took his savings, and without informing anyone, left the nursing home. Max called him a cab in advance. Soon Zev was on the train going to Cleveland. Max had planned everything in advance and told Zev to follow the instructions from the letter exactly, crossing out each item after completing it. Concerned Charles went to the administration of the nursing home. They promised to do everything they could to find his father. Probably his dementia began to progress after Ruth was gone. Waking up on the train, Zev was again disoriented and called out for Ruth. Only after reading the letter did he remember why he was here. In order not to get lost in time, Zev wrote a pen on his hand instructing to read the letter right away. He was met at the train station by a man who, on Max's instructions, brought him to the gun store where Zev had purchased the Glock. The salesman wrote him on a piece of paper how to use it properly. After that, Zev arrived at the hotel, in a pre-booked room. All expenses had already been paid. Almost immediately Zev received a call from Max, who had given the hotel administration a number of instructions the day before. First of all, Max was interested in whether his friend had obtained a weapon. Zev dozed off in the bathtub, and when he woke up, he called for his wife again. When he saw the gun and the half-erased writing on his hand, Zev remembered. The next day he arrived at the appointed address, having crossed out the relevant item in the letter. Zev knocked on the door and asked the woman if Rudy Kurlander was home. She said he was downstairs. Meeting the older man, Zev drew the Glock from his purse and told Rudy to come to the window. As the light fell on Rudy's face, Zev tried to figure out if they knew each other. It turned out that Rudy was from Germany and had served in the German army 70 years earlier. Zev is convinced that Rudy served at Auschwitz, but he assures that this is not true. He knew nothing about Auschwitz until after the war because he served in North Africa under Rommel's command. He provided photographs as proof. Zev called Max and told him that this Rudy had nothing to do with what went on in Auschwitz. Max told his friend to keep looking, because he had to keep his promise. Driving to the next address, Zev reread the letter. Max wrote that at the end of World War II, German officers were stealing prisoners' documents. One SS Blockführer immigrated under the name Rudy Kurlander. There are 4 Rudy Kurlanders living in North America who immigrated during that period. His real name is Otto Walisch. Zev's task is to find him at any cost. While Charles contacted to all sorts of authorities that could help him find his father, Zev drove up to the Canadian border. At customs, he was asked the purpose of his visit. Zev answered that he was going to visit a friend in a hospital. When he was asked to show his passport, it turned out that the document had expired. Then the customs officer asked for his driver's license and settled the problem. No one knows that Zev hid the gun in the bus. Soon he arrived at the hospital. The administrator escorted him to the room where Rudy Kurlander was being treated. Drawing a curtain so that the other patient could not see, Zev began to ask Rudy, who was very ill, about his past. The man replied that he had been in Auschwitz during the war. Zev said he had been there too. He lost his entire family there and swore revenge on the man who was responsible for it. Seeing the number tattooed on Rudy's arm, Zev realized that he was not in the concentration camp as a warder, but as a prisoner. Asking for his forgiveness, Zev cried. In the hospital corridor he heard music. Some woman was playing the piano. Zev also knows how to play, but hasn't done so in years. The woman suggested that he play something. Soon Zev continued on his way and arrived at the hotel. Max again made sure to book a room in advance. Since Zev forgot to take change of clothes with him, he went to the store. The salesman helped him pick out clothes, but the alarm went off on the way out. The security guard checked his bags and found the gun in one of them. The man said his first gun was also a Glock and wished Zev a good day. Max recalls telling Zev that he had to find Otto Walisch by all means. Meanwhile, a waitress at the cafe accidentally spills coffee on Zev's letter. In his room, he dried it with a hairdryer and rewrote the few fragments while reading Max's instructions aloud. Apart from him, Zev is the only person capable of recognizing the man who took their families away from them by his face. Zev arrived at the third address, but the owner of the house was not there. The house is in a remote area. Zev waited for several hours, during which time the postman brought a parcel. This is how Zev learned that the recipient was one John Kurlander. Soon John arrived, who turned out to be a policeman. From him Zev learned that John's father, Rudy, had passed away 3 months earlier. Thinking Zev was a friend of his father's, John invited him into the house. Zev asked John if the father had ever told him about Germany. John suggested that the new acquaintance look at his father's collection, who was constantly reminiscing about Germany. The room turned out to be full of items with Nazi symbols. John said it was his father's pride. Zev opened an album of old photographs, and then found an SS uniform in a box.
Priceless, right?
John offered the guest a drink in honor of his father's memory and helped him remove his jacket. John was perplexed, however, when Zev stated that he had met Rudy at Auschwitz. John said that this was impossible because his father had never served at Auschwitz. He was only a cook in the army, not a Blockführer. He was only 10 years old when the war began. When John saw the tattoo of the number on Zev's arm, he thought he was Jewish and became enraged. John realized that Zev was not a friend of his father, but had come here for an entirely different purpose. John became aggressive, and Zev wet himself with fright. This made John even more furious, for the presence here of a Jew desecrates the memory of his father. John sicked his sheepdog on Zev, then Zev used his Glock, taking the lives of both the dog and John. Zev crossed out the penultimate address, which turned out to be wrong. After that, he took a shower, changed his clothes, and fell asleep. When Zev woke up, he started calling for Ruth again. Because of his disorientation, he could not remember where he was or what had happened here. After reading the letter, Zev remembered his promise and called Max, telling him that he had taken the life of the wrong man. That was not part of their plan. Max asked his friend if he wanted to continue. Zev replied that he was willing to do so. There was one last address left, and that was where Zev went. When he got off at the bus stop, he thought he saw his wife Ruth on the road. Zev followed her and was hit by a car. Charles was immediately informed of what had happened. He was shocked to learn that his father was now in Nevada. Zev, who was in the hospital room, received a call from his son. Zev assured him that all was well and that Ruth would soon pick him up. He remembered that his wife had passed away only when the girl, who was hospitalized in the same room, read the letter aloud to him. Zev remembered his promise and realized he had to go. It turned out that Max and Zev had met at the nursing home 6 months earlier. Max immediately remembered him from Auschwitz, but Zev, because of his dementia, did not remember him at all. The fact that they had met at the end of their lives turned out to be a real miracle. Only by working together could they exact vengeance on Otto Walisch. As soon as Ruth passed away, Zev promised Max, who was confined to a wheelchair, to find Otto. He escaped from the hospital and returned to the hotel. The first thing he did was to call Max and tell him he was ready to meet Otto Walisch. Charles is looking for his father, who has run away again. He contacted to the cab company, and that is how he found out where his father had gone. The next morning Zev arrived at the last address. It was a beautiful house in the countryside. The door was opened by a woman named Kristen, who told him that Rudy was still asleep. When she learned that Zev was a friend of her father's, she invited him into the house. Kristen immediately guessed that Zev's appearance was connected to Auschwitz. She said that her father would hardly want to talk about it. Rudy's granddaughter, Inga, said hello to Zev. He began to play the piano without noticing Otto Walisch approaching him. Zev immediately recognized him by his voice, for it had not changed over the years. When Zev turned to face him, Otto recognized him, too. They began to speak in German, and Otto suggested that Zev go out into the courtyard. Zev remembered to take his purse with him. Otto confessed that all these years he had carefully concealed from his family and everyone else who he really was. No one ever found out his real name. Zev was shocked when Otto hugged him. The man was equally shocked when Zev called him Otto Walisch and accused him of taking his family away from him. Zev said he intended to put an end to the lie. Rudy watched in incomprehension as he drew the gun from his purse. Meanwhile, Charles arrives at the Kurlander house, looking for his father. Charles, Kristen, and her daughter were shocked to see Zev pointing the Glock at Rudy, demanding that he tell them who he really is. Rudy tried to assure everyone that Zev was crazy, then the man pointed the Glock at Inga. To save his granddaughter, Rudy confessed that during the war he had not been a prisoner in Auschwitz. He was a Blockführer at Auschwitz. The daughter and granddaughter could not believe it. Zev demanded that Rudy tell them his real name. Rudy said his name was Kunibert Sturm. Zev stated that this was a lie, for his real name was Otto Walisch. Without stopping to cry, Kunibert said that Zev was Otto Walisch. They were both Blockführers at Auschwitz, and when Germany lost the war, they tattooed themselves as prisoners, stole their documents, and escaped to America under false names. For 70 years they hid the truth. Zev, that is Otto, could not believe what he heard, and neither could Charles. Otto took Kunibert's life first, and then himself. Meanwhile, in the nursing home, the residents were watching the news on television and lamenting what had happened to Zev. Many were convinced that because of his dementia he didn't know what he was doing. But Max assured them that Zev knew exactly what he was doing. It was Otto Walisch and Kunibert Sturm who had once taken his family away from Max. And 70 years later, Max Rosenbaum finally took his revenge. All this time he had kept a photograph of Otto Walisch in his possession, waiting for fate to bring them together again.